Hello, my name is Elena Hart. I used to work as a nurse at St. Gabriel's Hospital, mostly in the night shift, because I liked the quiet hours when the world seemed to exhale and you could almost hear the prayers of the weary. 3 years ago, driving home after a long shift, my car was struck on the highway. I remember the glass, the sound, and then silence. No pain, just the silence. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the wreck. I stood in a place that felt more real than anything I had ever known, as though Earth had only been the shadow, and this the substance. My name is Elena Hart. I never imagined that one day I would stand before others and speak of what lies beyond the veil between breathing and stillness. I lived an ordinary life, one filled with routines, alarms, and coffee cups that cooled before I ever finished them. I worked as a night shift nurse at St. Gabriel's Hospital, tucked away on the quiet edge of the city. The night shift had always drawn me, not because of the peace, but because it felt closer to mystery. When most of the world slept, the hospital glowed like a lighthouse for the weary. People arrived in pain, in fear, in hope. Some left healed, others left us forever. And I often wondered where they truly went when their bodies fell silent. I was 29, and I thought I understood death, or at least its outer shape. I had seen hundreds of final breaths. I had held hands that grew cold beneath mine. I had whispered prayers for strangers and watched monitors slow to that final, unwavering line. Yet none of that prepared me for the night I became the patient instead of the nurse. It was early spring. I remember the smell of rain and gasoline on the road. I had just finished a 12-hour shift. My eyelids were heavy, but the road home was familiar, almost automatic. There was music playing, a soft hymn my mother used to hum when I was little. It was one of those moments that felt halfway between waking and dreaming. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A truck had lost control at the intersection. There was no time to react, no space for a thought, no room for fear. The world flashed white. There was the sound of metal folding, glass breaking, the sudden violence of impact, and then silence. Not darkness, silence. It wasn't the silence of absence, but of completion, like the moment after a song ends, but the final note still trembles in the air. I became aware that I was still myself, though I couldn't feel my body. It was as though I had stepped out of a coat I no longer needed. I saw the wreckage below the car, the lights, the movement of paramedics rushing. I realized with strange calmness that they were working on me. There was no panic, no confusion, only a deep, steady awareness that I was watching from somewhere else, somewhere higher, where fear couldn't reach. Time seemed different. It didn't pass, it unfolded. Every moment was layered with meaning, as if I could sense the reason behind every small thing. The rain, the light from a nearby street lamp, even the sound of sirens all carried a quiet harmony I had never heard before. I remember wondering, with the curiosity of a child, whether I had died or simply woken up. I tried to look back, to move toward the scene, but I felt myself drawn upward, as if by an unseen current. There was no struggle. My thoughts became lighter, and my memories began to open like pages in a book, each one luminous with understanding. I saw my mother's face as she prayed for me that morning. I saw the patients I had comforted in their final hours. I understood, without words, that every act of compassion had been a thread in something infinitely larger than I had ever imagined. The air, if it could be called air, shimmered. It carried no weight, no pressure, and then came the light. Not a light that blinded, but one that revealed. It came from everywhere and nowhere, warm as sunrise, yet clear as crystal. It felt alive, aware, intelligent, personal. It was not a light that fell on me. It was a light that came through me, as though I had always belonged to it. There was no thought of where I was going, only the sense that I was being gently led into something vast and familiar. The fear of death, the thing I had always seen grip others in their final moments, was utterly gone. What replaced it was peace so deep it silenced even memory itself. It wasn't rest, it was recognition. I had not lost life, I had only stepped through it. There was a moment, perhaps no more than a heartbeat, perhaps an eternity, when everything I had known dissolved into stillness. I was aware, completely aware, yet unbound by the weight of flesh or the measure of time. I no longer heard the sirens or felt the pull of gravity. The noise of the world faded like a distant echo retreating down a long corridor, and in its place came a quiet so profound it seemed to pulse with life. I found myself standing, though there was no ground as I once understood it. The space around me shimmered, neither dark nor bright, but alive with a kind of translucent radiance. It wasn't color in the earthly sense, it was meaning made visible. Every hue carried emotion, every shade whispered truth. I felt surrounded by awareness, as though the very atmosphere knew I was there and rejoiced in my being. I remember thinking, I'm not afraid. That realization surprised me. I had expected, if death were real, it would be frightening, disorienting, even cold. But instead, I felt the first real warmth I had ever known. It didn't touch the skin, it touched the soul. It moved through me like a song I had always known but forgotten how to hum. I tried to remember who I had been, my name, my work, my body, but those things no longer seemed to define me. I was not less myself, I was more. Every boundary that had made me small was gone, and yet I felt no pride, only clarity. I understood myself not as separate, but as belonging, not as lost, but as finally seen. There was movement in the light, a subtle drawing forward. It was not a command, but an invitation, as gentle as a breath. I began to sense a presence ahead, not approaching, yet not distant. It was everywhere at once, near as heartbeat, vast as the horizon. The closer I became, the more I realized that closer was a poor word. Distance did not exist here, thought itself was movement, desire and direction were one. A voice spoke, not in sound, but in knowing. It said my name, the moment it did. Everything that I was unfolded before me, like a story written in living flame. It was the same name my mother used when she wanted me to come home after playing outside, the same tone that held both affection and authority. Yet in that voice was something far beyond human memory. It held every moment I had ever lived, every choice, every sorrow, every joy. It called me, not to account, but to belonging. I wanted to speak, to answer, but words were impossible. Speech was too small for what needed to be said. Instead, my soul answered in understanding. I knew without thinking that this voice was the one who had been near me every day of my life, even when I did not believe, even when I did not ask. Around me, the light began to gather into form. It was not sudden, not startling, but natural, like dawn finding shape in the mist. The brilliance softened into a radiance that carried warmth and purpose. I sensed that all of heaven was aware of this moment, not as an audience, but as family awaiting reunion. The light pulsed once more, and I could feel love flowing toward me, thick and alive, like the tide of an endless ocean. It entered me without resistance, filling every hollow place, washing away every fear. I could not remember what guilt felt like. I could not remember shame or regret. They had no language here. There was only recognition, the deep, wordless realization that I was made for this love, and had been carrying the ache of it my entire life. I became aware that the light was not just a force but a face, a presence both infinite and personal. The boundaries of my understanding trembled as I began to see him, not as imagination, but as reality more solid than stone, more tender than breath, more ancient than time. The light around me gathered until it was no longer light alone, but someone. It was not that form emerged from brilliance, but that brilliance itself was the form. Every particle of that radiance knew me. It was as though the universe had drawn breath, and in that breath remembered my name. I did not see a throne or a blaze too great for eyes. I saw the gentlest strength, a majesty so humble it made me weep without knowing why. And then I realized I was looking at him. If I could describe him in human words, I would fail before I began. There was a face, yet it seemed made of eternity itself. There were eyes, but they held oceans of knowing that went deeper than all sorrow. There was warmth that was not fire but life itself, flowing outward, uncontainable, like mercy made visible. I felt no fear, no urge to fall or hide. Instead, everything false in me simply dissolved. It was not judgment that undid me, it was love. He smiled, not as men smile, not politely or briefly, but with a joy that seemed older than creation. When his gaze met mine, I felt everything about me being rewritten, as though he were not looking at me, but through me. And through that gaze he was restoring what I had forgotten I was. I wanted to speak, but my thoughts themselves became words, and he answered them before they were formed. Each response was a flood of meaning that entered my spirit like sunlight filling a crystal. He spoke, and the words were not sound, they were being. You were never lost, the meaning said, you were never unseen. In his presence all questions that had tormented me, why pain, why death, why silence, lost their sharpness. They didn't disappear, they simply became too small to matter in the light of him. I understood that truth was not a set of answers but a person, standing before me, radiant and calm, wearing eternity as easily as a shepherd wears his cloak. His hands drew my attention next. They were strong hands, working hands, the hands of one who had known wood and nails, the texture of this earth. In them I saw history itself, suffering and redemption, woven together, until they were no longer two separate threads. I sensed that every human sorrow had once passed through those hands, and that nothing, no grief, no failure had been wasted. When he moved toward me, I felt myself being remade, not as if I were becoming someone different, but as if the truest version of myself, hidden beneath years of fear, doubt, and guilt, was stepping forward for the first time. There was no need for apology. Repentance existed as joy. Every regret I carried melted into gratitude, because even my mistakes had been rewritten into mercy. He laughed once, softly, like the echo of creation's first morning. That sound contained galaxies. It told me that joy is not a reward, but the heartbeat of existence itself. The stars, the rivers, the laughter of children, all of them were faint reflections of that single sound. He showed me, not in words but by pure knowing, that love had never been an emotion or an ideal, but a substance, the very foundation of everything real. Where love is absent, reality thins. Where love is perfect, existence becomes whole. And he was the center of it all, the source from which every heartbeat, every sunrise, every act of kindness had ever drawn its meaning. I found that I could remember my life on earth with new eyes. Every patient I attended, every tear I had shed beside a hospital bed, Every silent prayer whispered in exhaustion, they all shimmered now like small threads woven into his light. He was showing me that nothing done in love was ever forgotten, that even the smallest kindness had eternal weight, that time itself bowed to love's persistence. And as he stood before me, I understood that this was not a meeting of stranger and deity, but of child and homecoming. When his gaze rested fully upon me, the space around us shifted. It was not movement in distance, but in depth, like the surface of a lake becoming transparent to reveal what had always been beneath. He said nothing, yet meaning began to rise in me, like dawn breaking behind the heart. It was not a command, nor a revelation given from above, but a remembering of what my soul had always known and longed for. What I saw was not merely a place, but a life beyond measure, an existence so vast that words like afterlife seemed pitifully small. It was living made pure, life without decay, joy without shadow. The first thing he showed me was creation without corruption. I beheld people shaping, crafting, composing not to prove themselves, not to survive, but to celebrate. There were gardens growing colors I had never seen, melodies being woven in the air by souls who had once been silent on earth. To create there was to sing with God's own imagination. Every brushstroke, every sound, every thought was an act of communion. We were co-authors of beauty, and beauty itself was worship. Then he revealed the second, learning without exhaustion. Knowledge there was not collected, but experienced. Truth was alive, not a fact to memorize, but a reality to encounter. Every discovery deepened joy instead of pride. To learn was to draw nearer to the heart of God, for all truth was a window into his mind. Even the smallest revelation filled the spirit with the thrill of belonging, the delight of finding what had never been lost. The third wonder was recognition beyond the body. I saw souls meeting, some who had known each other in life, others who had only brushed paths briefly. Yet they knew one another completely, not by face, but by essence. Love was the language of sight. You did not ask, "Who are you?" You simply knew, because their very being sang their story. Every relationship was honest, purified of misunderstanding. To be known there was not exposure but peace. The fourth was movement without distance. Desire itself became travel. To long for a place was to arrive, for in heaven nothing stands between yearning and fulfillment. I saw mountains of light, oceans that shimmered with awareness, meadows breathing praise. Yet no one needed to walk there, because the will and the way were one. It was freedom without hurry, exploration without loss. The fifth wonder was service without burden. There were tasks, yes, but each act was delight. To serve was to sing. No one sought rest from labor, because labor itself was rest. Every gesture was in harmony with divine purpose, and the smallest action lifting, tending, mending resounded like a hymn through creation. Service there was not commanded. It was the natural motion of love. Then came the sixth, memory transfigured. Every sorrow I had ever felt appeared before me, but now radiant. None of it was erased. All was redeemed. The pain that once seemed meaningless now pulsed with hidden glory. I understood that suffering, when surrendered to love, becomes seed for joy. Even regret was turned to gratitude. The scars of the soul glowed like jewels, telling the story of mercy. And then the seventh wonder, laughter with God himself. It was not the laughter of jest or mockery, but of pure, shared delight, the laughter that existed before time began. It echoed through the light like a child's joy magnified beyond measure. I understood then that joy is not an emotion, but the atmosphere of heaven. All things, music, color, even silence, were alive with that laughter. It was the heartbeat of eternity, the rhythm by which all creation moved. As I beheld these 7 wonders, I realized they were not 7 separate things, but 7 notes of one great harmony. Each truth flowed into the next like rivers meeting in the sea, forming a song that had been playing beneath the surface of life all along, waiting for souls to finally hear it when the visions of heaven's wonders quieted. I became aware of something deeper than sight, something like the hush between waves. The radiance around me softened until it felt almost tender, as if the whole of eternity was holding its breath. I stood before him still, Jesus, the center of all light, the unbroken calm at the heart of the cosmos, and though not a word had been spoken, I sensed that a new moment was drawing near. The air, if one could call it that, trembled with meaning. It was the kind of stillness that precedes change, though there was no fear in it, only understanding. I felt his gaze rest upon me, not as a king studies a servant, but as a friend looks upon a beloved one who is about to leave for a long journey. There was a sorrow in his eyes, though not of loss, rather of love so vast it contained sorrow without being consumed by it. He moved closer, and the space between us folded into light. When he spoke, the words were not sound but truth awakening inside me. You cannot remain. The meaning fell through me like a gentle stone through water, rippling through every thought, every memory, every longing. It was not a command. It was a knowing that came from beyond time. In that instant I understood. Heaven was not merely a place to enter after death. It was the home from which all things had come, and yet it was not yet my dwelling. I had been allowed to see it, to taste it, but not to stay. The realization stirred something human in me, a longing so deep it ached. I felt like a child who has seen the sea for the first time and is told to return to the valley. He looked at me with what I can only call tender authority. It was the look of someone who knows every sorrow of parting, but also sees the purpose behind it. He reached toward me, not with hands of flesh, but with presence itself, and I felt that touch not upon my body, but upon my being. Where he touched, peace replaced the ache, not by removing it, but by transforming it into something that could bear meaning. You must go back, he said, not as sound, but as being poured into my spirit. There is something unfinished. You are not done yet. My thoughts stirred like leaves in wind. Go back to the body, the pain, the noise, the endless hurry of earth. I remembered the hospital corridor, the bitter coffee, the faces of patients whose names I had whispered to heaven. I remembered exhaustion, loneliness, the strange quiet that followed each death. How could I return to that after this? But before I could speak, he placed something within me. Not an object, not even a vision, but an assurance that glowed like fire hidden beneath snow. I understood that I was not being sent back empty. Heaven had been written into me, not as memory, but as seed. You will tell them, he said, though no words passed his lips. Tell them that heaven is not later. It is now. Tell them that love is not preparation for eternity. It is the beginning of it. The meaning of those words unfurled in me like a book being opened to a page I had never read but had always known was there. I saw how every act of kindness on earth shimmered faintly with heavenly light, how every sacrifice, every forgiveness, every prayer whispered in secret was already participating in the life beyond. Heaven was not distant. It was near, pressing against the thin veil of our distractions, waiting to be let in. I felt the pull then, subtle at first, then stronger. It was like being caught in the tide of a great current, one that moved not backward or forward but inward, through time and memory and matter. The light began to thin, though it did not fade. I felt the weight of the world drawing me, the gravity of the life I had left. For the first time since leaving the body, I remembered pain, not as sensation, but as a memory of limitation. The thought of returning to that fragile shell filled me with dread, not for fear of suffering, but for fear of forgetting. I did not want to lose this clarity, this awareness of His presence. I wanted to stay where every breath was praise, where love was as natural as breathing. But His gaze held me, steady and kind, and I knew that even earth could become sacred if I carried this love within me. Then the light folded in upon itself, and the brilliance of heaven became smaller, like a sunrise seen through closing eyes. I felt myself falling not down, but through layers of being, through sound, through weight, through the throb of pulse returning. The air around me grew heavy. My chest heaved, and pain rushed in like cold wind through an open door. I gasped, and the world came roaring back. The hum of machines, the startled cries of nurses, the sting of oxygen in my lungs. I was in the hospital again. My body ached, my ribs burned, and yet there was peace beneath the pain, the echo of His words ringing silently in my soul. I tried to speak, but my lips would not move. Still, within the stillness of that recovery room, I heard the echo of eternity whispering through the spaces between heartbeats. I understood that what I had seen was not meant to be kept hidden as a treasure, but shared as a light. My life had been given back to me, not as a continuation of the old, but as the beginning of something new, an unfinished chapter still being written by unseen hands. The veil had closed, but the memory of the light did not dim. The days that followed my return were not easily spoken of. To wake again in flesh after touching eternity is to feel both miracle and ache in every breath. My body, broken from the accident, healed slowly, but my spirit, if one can call it, that seemed to exist in two worlds at once. The hospital room felt smaller than I remembered, its walls too close, its light too dull. Yet within that small space I could still sense something vast pressing through, as though heaven itself were leaning near, just beyond the edges of the visible. Every sound carried new meaning. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor became a hymn of mercy. The sterile scent of disinfectant reminded me of the fragrance of light I had known beyond. The nurse's hurried footsteps echoed like the music of service. I realized that nothing ordinary had ever truly been ordinary. It was only our blindness that had stripped the sacred from the simple. When my strength returned, I found that my way of seeing others had changed. Where I once saw illness, I now saw stories, living parables of grace in motion. Each patient carried a spark of that same eternal light, hidden beneath fear, confusion, or pain. I could no longer rush through my work. I moved slowly, listening with a patience that felt borrowed from elsewhere. It was as if heaven had lent me its heartbeat for a while, that I might feel how precious every soul truly is. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I would close my eyes and remember His words, "Heaven is not later. Heaven begins wherever love is allowed to rule." Those words followed me like breath itself. I began to see how the world had always been meant to be a mirror of that higher country. The problem was never that heaven was distant, but that we had grown deaf to its music. I started to notice the moments where heaven pressed closest to earth, a mother forgiving her child, a stranger offering kindness without reward, an old man whispering a prayer of gratitude. Through pain, these were not small things. They were portals. Every act of love opened a door. Every mercy widened the horizon. I saw how heaven was not a place to escape to, but a reality we were meant to reveal. One evening, I walked through the hospital garden. The flowers had closed for the night, but their fragrance still lingered in the cool air. A patient in a wheelchair sat nearby, staring at the stars. I sat beside him, and he told me he was afraid of dying, afraid of not being remembered. I listened, and then, without thinking, I said, "You will not be forgotten, not because the world will remember you, but because love cannot forget what it has made." He looked at me with tears that were not of fear anymore, but release. In that moment, I understood the quiet command hidden within my experience, to live as one who has seen the other side, but walks this side with open eyes. Heaven's message was not meant to make me long for departure, but to teach me how to inhabit earth differently. People began to ask what I had seen, and though I tried to tell them, words seemed too thin for truth. How could I explain the light that breathes, the laughter that creates galaxies, the love that contains all meaning? So instead of trying to describe it, I tried to live it. I learned that testimony is not always spoken. It is embodied. The world does not need more tales of heaven. It needs living evidence that heaven's character can dwell within human hearts. I began to notice how easily we forget the eternal when surrounded by the urgent. The noise of life drowns the still, small music. We rush to build, to buy, to argue, to plan, while eternity waits quietly at the corner of every moment. I realized that my task was not to make people believe in the next world, but to help them notice this one until it began to glow with the same light. There were days when I longed for that presence again, the warmth of his gaze, the laughter that held all creation. But in the silence of prayer, I would sometimes feel a familiar whisper, "I am not gone. You are my hands now." And I understood that to love here was to continue his work there. I began to see the world as a rehearsal for eternity. Every act of compassion is a note of the great symphony that will one day be played in full. Every kindness, no matter how small, is the echo of divine laughter. Even sorrow, when offered in love, becomes an instrument of glory. Earth is not the waiting room of heaven. It is the workshop where the materials of eternity are gathered and shaped. I would sometimes return to the roadside where I had died. The marks of the accident had faded, the ground healed by time. Yet standing there, I felt no fear, no sadness, only gratitude. That place was both my ending and my beginning. I understood that death had not been the opposite of life, but the doorway through which life had shown its true size. Now every day feels like borrowed light. The simplest moments, washing my hands, hearing a child's laughter, feeling wind through a window, carry the weight of sacredness. Nothing is wasted. Every breath is a prayer if it is received with love. And love, I have learned, is the only language heaven speaks fluently. There are times when people ask me if I miss heaven. I tell them no, I don't miss it, because heaven once seen is never lost. It hides in the faces we pass, in the hands we hold, in the forgiveness we give and receive. It is woven through the fabric of the world, waiting for eyes that can see, waiting for hearts that remember when I stood before death. I thought I had reached the end of everything I knew. Yet death, as I discovered, is not the end but the great unveiling. It strips away what is temporary so that what is eternal may finally be seen. I crossed that threshold. I met the one who holds all things together, and I returned not to tell a story of fear, but a story of home. I have learned that heaven is not a distant realm we enter only when our hearts stop beating. It is a reality that begins to breathe through us the moment we choose love over bitterness, forgiveness over anger, mercy over pride. Each time we act in kindness, we are not merely doing good. We are rehearsing eternity. Each time we lift another, heaven leans closer to earth. The light I saw there has not left me. It moves quietly through the world, searching for those who will carry it forward. It does not need grand words or flawless faith. It needs only open hands, willing hearts, and eyes that dare to see holiness in the ordinary. I died once, but it was in dying that I discovered what it truly means to live. And now every breath, every act of love, every whispered prayer is a step closer, not toward some faraway paradise, but toward the fullness of heaven already blooming among us, waiting to be revealed through the lives of those who remember what they were made for.